Ukraine and Russia have arguably been different for centuries, but in modern times, the greatest split came when Ukraine gained its independence on the 24th of August, 1991. Since then, independence has been reinforced by a wave of revolutions that have gradually transformed Ukraine into a pluralistic young democracy with a vibrant civil society. But also their approach to historical memory has been radically different, and the willingness to face up to the traumas of the past, or to bury them and deny them for expediency and to consolidate power in the present, means that Ukraine and Russia have been on very different paths of development. Today, I'm speaking to David Satter, journalist and historian with unique insights into how the deformation and repression of the past is having terrible consequences for present-day Russia. David has written extensively about Russia and the Soviet Union, especially the decline and fall of the USSR and rise of post-Soviet Russia. David became the first American journalist to be expelled from Russia since the Cold War in December 2013. This was perhaps not surprising, given that his books have covered topics such as the FSB's role in the apartment bombings that brought Putin to power and the criminalization of Russia under Boris Yeltsin. David's core theme is why a pluralistic and progressive state did not emerge from the collapse of the Soviet Union and how this understanding guides its current politics and actions. And in the description of this video, I'm going to put links to some of the excellent articles and books that David has written, including It Was a Long Time Ago, and It Never Happened Anyway, Darkness at Dawn, The Rise of the Russian Criminal State, and The Less You Know, The Better You Sleep, which has to be one of the most engaging book titles, I think, ever written. Welcome to Silicon Curtain Podcast. Please like and subscribe if you like the content we produce. David, welcome back to the channel.
Thank you. Glad to be with you, Jonathan.
Well, let's start with recent events, and an extraordinary piece of legislation was signed into law in Russia last week, I think it was, seeking to reinforce traditional values. But some people think this heralds a new age of repression against those who don't fit into the narrow definition of family values that appears in that legislation. And it's been suggested, of course, that this might herald a new age of repression against minorities in Russia as Putin seeks to try and regain control over the regime and the country.
You know, it's my understanding that they affect gay marriage and the like. You know, I haven't been following them that closely. Maybe you can refresh my memory as to what exactly the laws say.
My understanding is that anyone, not just who is, let's say, on the media seeking to talk about gay relationships or any other themes. I mean, previously they could already be prosecuted for promoting those lifestyles. Now this seems to be far more broad-ranging, so that anyone with any kind of association with this loosely defined non-traditional values is at risk of persecution, imprisonment. So I guess it's not radically new, but as is typically in Russia, the vagueness of the law, the ambiguity inherent within it, might herald, a new age of repression and terrorization, or even otherness. Defining otherness within society in order to try and regain control.
My guess is that type of legislation is aimed not so much at Russian society, but at the outside world, to give the impression that Russia is fighting for traditional family values and to encourage those people in the West who are not happy about gay rights and the strides that sexual minorities have made, persuading them to sympathize with Russia. This is a tactic that's been employed before on a variety of issues. Everything that from gun control to patriotic education, to opposition to globalization, to, as we say, gay rights. And the purpose is not so much, I think, to change the situation in Russia, but rather to make those people who are unhappy, about all these things, feel that Russia is getting a raw deal, that it's a Christian country under assault from globalized elites and the like. So I think this is what's at stake here. And also, needless to say, I'm sure that legislation also contained references to transgenders. So this is used by the Russian government and also by the controlled Russian Orthodox hierarchy, the controlled hierarchy of the Russian Orthodox Church, to create really the false impression that Russia is a moral country and that it's concerned about moral values. They count on the fact that that their target audience is made up of people who know next to nothing about Russia and are consumed with issues that apply only in their own societies, and as a result will take seriously pretty much anything that the Russians say. But I don't think that it necessarily signals big changes within Russia. The situation in Russia right now is repressive enough. They have ample means of clamping down on inconvenient behavior and inconvenient speech. Adding these measures won't appreciably change the situation, but it will be there will be those in the West who will react the way they want them to react.
And of course, yeah, I mean that's a very interesting point, because of course a lot of the debate and that has followed this legislation, I mean, it does echo a lot of themes you would see on, say, Fox News. It would potentially appeal perhaps to those of a more right-leaning disposition, let's say, and give the impression that maybe there's a natural alliance between, say, the GOP and certain politicians and of course pundits on Fox News and those other sources which are even further to the right.
Yes, and not just the U.S. either, but people who hold similar views in Western Europe and in the UK Well, the UK is part of Western Europe, but nonetheless.
And Hungary, Serbia, I mean, there are many places.
Well, yeah, but the place, well, Serbia, of course, already is an ally. But what they're trying to do is weaken Western resolve and confuse Western public opinion, because the reality is that Russia is not a moral state, and it's not concerned about Christian values in the true sense. But of course, those people who are obsessed with these issues will be influenced to a certain degree.
And does Putin rely at all upon the sort of ultra-religious within Russia, or the religious establishment? How far is the support of relatively extreme views in Russia important to him, or is he able to essentially rule, without necessarily pandering to them?
Well, he feels that it's advantageous to pander to them, and he and those around him make strenuous efforts to underscore their religiosity, their nationalism. The Russian Orthodox Church has issued statements denying the universal applicability of human rights and the obligation of the citizen to subordinate himself to the state and support the goals of the state. All of this is tailored to kind of create a false universe for Russian citizens in which the actions of the regime, no matter how self-serving, are seen as legitimate and justified.
And I see recently you've been speaking about how the Western support for Ukraine has really changed over the last 9 months, because gradually the flow of armaments and the I would say the strength of those armaments going from defensive to more offensive weaponry has changed. But what's your view of that sort of changing nature of support now that we are 9 months into the war?
Well, I think that as the Russian tactics become more barbaric, the attacks on its civilian infrastructure, the the use of terror in the occupied territories, uh, the penetration of NATO's own border, whether by accident or intentionally, in the recent incident in which 2 people were killed. All of this will have the effect, I believe, of putting great pressure on Western governments to increase their level of support. I think the fact that Ukraine is being attacked with Iranian-made drones, and that this has wrought havoc in certain areas, is a very strong argument for extending some type of no-fly zone over large parts of Ukrainian territory. And failing that, providing Ukraine with the America's most up-to-date anti-aircraft weaponry. Now, the Ukrainians were very keen to get the Israeli Iron Dome, and the Israelis refused to give it to them. But the U.S. also has anti-missile technology. Maybe not quite. Iron Dome is the product of very specific algorithms and development that Israel, for whatever reason, and I think it's perhaps understandable, is loath to share with the rest of the world. But the U.S. has been also working on this problem, and I'm not sure if what we can provide to the Ukrainians would be at exactly the same level of effectiveness, but it will offer some protection more than they have right now. The important thing is to speed up those deliveries as best we can to the to overcome whatever obstacles exist to getting it to the Ukrainians so they can defend against these attacks on civilian targets.
I mean, even with the S-300s and the older systems and the sort of mishmash of defensive systems that they're now having to operate from multiple countries, they do seem to have quite a good hit rate. Somewhere between sort of 7 and 8 out of 10 of the drones and missiles apparently are being taken out, which is extraordinary. Nonetheless, the missiles that are getting through seem to be wreaking havoc on the energy infrastructure. So how do you see this playing out? The first snows hit Kiev.
Well, I think it's, of course, there's a couple of questions here. First of all, can they improve the hit rate? I'm assuming that they can, which will make a difference. Second of all, how will Ukraine do once the weather gets very cold, as it is already beginning, and it will be dark earlier and earlier? Needless to say, this is an area in which Western help with generators, with alternative electricity supplies, with food, with, of course, ammunition and energy supplies, all of these things that Ukraine is going to need to be provided. And we must be aware, I think, that that attacks on infrastructure are attacks on the civilian population, and definitely capable of causing terrible hardship. Insofar as we support Ukraine, we want to make sure that the damage is minimized, if not prevented altogether.
And like the German effort to try and break the spirit of the British people during the Blitz, it was shown that no matter how intense the damage, no matter how vicious the bombing, it just doesn't work to break a people's will to resist, does it? And the
I don't
same is
think you
going to be
can
true.
I don't think bombing can. And another example of that is the British bombing of Germany, because in fact the Blitz and the attacks on British cities were early in the war, but the ongoing uh, attacks on Germany, and this was in a period in which we didn't have smart bombs, uh, were devastating in some cases. And there were firebombs and firestorms in Hamburg and Dresden, but it didn't break the will of the Germans to resist, and they were, of course, mobilized on behalf of a diabolical cause. So I think it's unreasonable to assume that Ukrainians facing Russian bombing, after all that they've been through, will be broken by that bombing. And the Ukrainians are perfectly well aware that at least for the moment they're winning the war on the ground.
I mean, Kurt Vonnegut was famously interested when the firebomb happened and emerged in to see the devastation, and the description he gave was quite moving, wasn't it? I don't know if you've read that passage.
Oh yeah, Slaughterhouse Five. He was the it was a terrible thing. But and this is one of the great discussions that's still going on: is were the Allied bombings of the civilian areas of Germany justified? As insofar as we had very little other way to influence the course of the war. And the war was a war that we needed to win. Uh, but that's a whole other subject. I mean, what's happened? Russia's was never under any threat itself. It never had the slightest need to attack Ukraine. And in fact, the only reason that war was launched was to strengthen the hold on power of a small kleptocratic group that and those people are as much the enemy of their own people as they are of the Ukrainians. So I think that uh, in evaluating these things, we need to bear in mind that there are vast differences in the goals that were being pursued, but nonetheless, however you look at it, bombing from the air doesn't seem to have much of an effect in changing people's minds or breaking morale. And we can, if we look, with the evidence of history, both, with both the Blitz and the bombing of German cities, we can be reasonably confident that that the Ukrainians under attack by the Russians will not change their point of view as a result, or change their loyalties.
And to an extent, I think something you said there. This war almost emerges from the lack of a mechanism for the transition of power in Russia. No clear process to choose a new leader, appoint a new leader, and to have a non-violent transition of power. And I think last time we were talking about the fact that actually, you can't even count Yeltsin as being a real democratic transition. It was more of a sort of backroom stitch-up. And moving forward, the world cannot afford for every time Russia has a problem in choosing its leadership or even shoring up a totalitarian leader in the present. The world cannot afford for these kind of things to happen every
No,
time.
absolutely not. Absolutely not. And war for Russia is a matter of internal policy. Russia makes war in order to strengthen the hold on power of those who are at the top, not because there's any kind of threat, because there isn't any, and there never has been. And the Russia's designs on Ukraine and on Crimea, they go back to the period even before the Soviet Union fell, when Yeltsin actually, at least according to press reports, mooted the idea of using tactical nuclear weapons against Ukraine if it didn't sign the Union Treaty. It was only when he realized that only by divesting himself of Ukraine, or in other words, taking Russia out of the Soviet Union without taking other countries with it, that he could hope to transform the economy and solidify his own position in power. But I mean, if his power interests had been served in his own eyes by an attack on Ukraine in 1999 and 1991, 1992, no guarantee that it wouldn't have happened, because that was the mentality. I mean, of course, we saw this with the first Chechen war when the head of the Security Council told Sergei Yashenkov, a Duma deputy, that Yeltsin needs a short, victorious war in order to improve his rating. So this is nothing new in any of this.
It's interesting mentioning Chechnya. I mean, the fundamental weakness that Russia has now fallen into, both militarily and economically, what are the implications then for what I dare call or label the sort of vassal states within the Russian Empire? Belarus, Chechnya, Tatarstan, and some of the others where Russians are a minority nationality. Does this weakness at the center perhaps suggest, more chaos, division, and conflict around the peripheries of the Russian Empire?
Very possible. Very, very possible. The thing is that the casualties in the non-Russian republics are astronomical. They're very high everywhere, but these are the poorest parts of the so-called Russian Federation. And many people had, joined the army because they didn't see an alternative financially for themselves. And it's almost inevitable that they will begin to wonder why their lives should be sacrificed in order to create a Slavic union involving Russia and Ukraine. At the same time, there's likely to be those death rates may be a factor in reigniting nationalist agitation in those places, and especially if the Putin regime is defeated and seen to be losing control under conditions in which rebellion is more and more plausible and more likely to succeed. That resentment could easily be translated into movement for separation from Russia and creation of independent states.
And I remember very vividly when I was traveling around Russia and speaking to people, the US, and people seem in Russia to have a curious love-hate relationship to the US, and it sort of, ping-pongs backwards and forwards, sometimes close to hate, sometimes closer to sort of adoration. But do you think in Putin's mind, he's not really fighting the Ukrainians because his ego couldn't accept that he's being beaten by what for him amounts to a people who are a sort of Untermenschen in the ex-Soviet empire, and he has a famous loathing, it seems, for the idea of Ukrainian independence. In his mind, is he really fighting, the great Satan, which is the US?
Well, of course, we don't have access to his mind directly, but we can judge by his pattern of behavior. I want to just make a brief detour on the subject of the love-hate relationship. There's a town in Russia called Ozyorsk. It used to be called Chelyabinsk 40, and it's a secret military installation where they enrich plutonium for the nuclear bombs that, of course, they're now threatening the world with. And the people there, of course, are super patriotic. Well, they're chosen for that. They live in a closed city. You can't enter the city without going through a checkpoint. But what do they call the main street in the city? They referred to, I think it was originally Prospect Lenin, and maybe it was changed, but it's referred to, but nobody calls it that. They call it Broadway. So, which is, just an example of as we say, the attitude toward the West, which is on the one hand imitative, and on the other hand hostile. And as far as what goes through Putin's mind, it's important to bear in mind that I think that he's driven not by hatred of the U.S., not by hatred of the Ukrainians, but simply by the exigencies of holding on to power, making these are real gluttons in every respect, and they don't respect any limits. The attack on Ukraine is necessary, not because they dream of adding Ukraine to the Russian Empire, because in fact it makes very little difference in the long run. What state the Ukrainians belong to, from the point of view of the welfare of the average Russian, or even the welfare of the regime. But what's important is the propaganda value, which is derived from that, because that unites the Russian people around a kleptocratic regime that works against their interests. And this is the way it has always functioned in Russia. The apartment bombings in 1999 were sufficient to distract the Russian people from the massive theft during the 90s under Yeltsin, and cause them to rally around a previously unknown political figure named Vladimir Putin, and elect him president because he posed as being the defender of the nation. Well, similarly, Russian propaganda has been working nonstop to depict the Ukrainians as enemies of Russia, as Nazis, as persecutors of Russian speakers and ethnic Russians. All of it is untrue, of course, but it was the necessary backdrop for pretending that when they invaded Ukraine, they were defending Russia. And the pose of defending Russia is so popular and works so well. And the notion that the defenders are going to restore Russian greatness is so effective that they were justified in thinking that a quick victory would boost their hold on power and make it impossible for them to be challenged for many years going forward. But they miscalculated, and they also miscalculated the reaction of the West.
And that sort of brings us to, I think, one of the topics I'm really keen to discuss, which is the 1930s and the failure to really reconcile or treat honestly the sort of terrible history of the Stalinist period and, everything that followed from it. And to an extent, describing what Putin has latched onto, whether he believes it or not, he's latched onto ideas that are based on aggression, territorial expansion, etc., and they have been effective. He potentially could have latched on and used the past and organizations like Memorial and the trauma of the past to craft a different kind of Russia. And I'm really interested to explore why that alternative view of actually objectively dealing with the past and using that process as a way of moving forward and creating a new Russian identity. Why did that not actually blossom into anything more? And now, of course, Memorial itself has been repressed, closed, and there is no examination of the traumatic past that has led to Putin's regime.
Well, I think you put it well yourself. I mean, they have no interest in this, in establishing any type of historical justice, because they themselves are representatives and the products of a repressive state. They will allow just enough information about what happened to reduce tension and let off steam, but they have no intention of a thorough reckoning with the past, the commemoration of the victims, the examination of guilt and innocence, the publication even of the lists of informers, because all of that would create democratic expectations that would be anathema to their hold on power. So they just, they will allow just enough to neutralize it as an issue, but not, excuse me, not really, that they have no real interest in the issue per se.
And I tend to think of the 90s as being a period where that was examined with a lot more seriousness, but that maybe is biased because many of my friends were students, many of my friends read books and were naturally interested in these kind of topics. But do you think that re-examination of the past ever really percolated down through Russian society? Because I know you've written very eloquently about when the burial grounds around Moscow, for where many of the mass shootings took place and executions were uncovered, there seemed to be a certain level of, let's say, official reticence at going anywhere near it. And it was quite a struggle, wasn't it, to even get the places recognized, let alone properly excavate them and explore them. And there are very few memorials actually set up in these places to to realize they were ever scenes of mass terror and crimes.
Well, the exposure of Stalin's crimes was one of the most important driving forces of perestroika, and it was supported by politicians who were opposed to the communist regime because it was an effective way of discrediting that regime. Once the regime was overthrown, interest in the issue dropped significantly in Russia until it was mainly focused on just the Memorial Society and those people who were its supporters. There began during the perestroika period to be plinths and pedestals erected at the scene of mass crimes. And invariably, the inscription was, on this site will be raised a memorial to the victims of Stalinist repression who perished here. Well, after the fall of the Soviet Union and the collapse of interest in past history, nothing was done in the overwhelming majority of cases. And the only thing that you can find to commemorate the victims are those pedestals that are still standing and are neglected. And if anything, they're a tribute to the destruction of memory in the country, because they talk about something that should have been done but never was.
And what are the differing approaches there? Because in the introduction, I suggested that Ukraine and Russia have gone down very different paths. Ukraine is in a process of, I think, digging deeper into their past in a more objective way. They're also creating new national myths, of course, but their trajectory and approach to history seems to be remarkably different since 1991 than that of Russia.
Well, I wouldn't say since 1991. I would say that once the Viktor Yushchenko became the president in 2004, there began to be serious efforts to commemorate the victims of the communist regime in Ukraine. But there too, there was a political motive. It was also something that could be used against opponents who were more pro-Russian. But needless to say, Ukraine's defining itself as a victim of these crimes rather than a co-conspirator has made a huge difference in the historical attitude and in the efforts to preserve the truth about what happened. I mean, Ukraine's done a lot of things. It opened up the KGB archives that were there, created a museum of the history of the Soviet period. They there have been actions taken in individual villages where there was mass starvation. So no, they have. Whereas in Russia, there's little interest in commemorating, even though many of the victims, for example, of the famine of 1932-33 lived in territory on the other side of the border and in Kazakhstan.
And one of the other themes I would want to explore, if an objective view of history and certain sort of identities that are there in Russian history are sort of neglected, what does the Putin regime owe as its kind of genetic code? Is it much more tied with, let's say, the NKVD and the history of the sort of secret state in Russia? Could it also be said, perhaps, that the roots of the current regime have much more in common with the Soviet criminal class, the sort of war of zakonia, or criminals, thieves within the law? Because in the 90s, at the same time as Memorial was doing its work, there was a very significant almost merging between the mafia state and the security state. I don't know whether you think that's overstating or not, but what's the roots of the current regime in criminality?
Well, the current regime is an amalgam, really, of the criminal world and the security state, because Yeltsin created fostered the development of a criminal state of bandit capitalism, and then to preserve it, you needed the FSB and the security state, to carry out provocations like the bombing of the buildings. At that point, you had someone who was part of the criminal state, but had a background in the security state, taking over as head of state, and he filled the position, leading positions with veterans of the security state. So you could say that it's an amalgam of the two now.
And I think probably the last question, because I know we're sort of coming to the end, and it's probably one which journalists and historians don't like answering, because it's almost like a sort of what if type question. But if we take the core of the Russian imperial project, Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia, how are their fates tied together? And how important is it for progress to be made that actually these three countries have their fates decoupled, that they become genuine sovereign states in order to be able to move forward and evolve?
Well, I mean, their fates are decoupled. They are sovereign states, and now with Russia's attack on Ukraine, the any residual sympathy between Russians and Ukrainians has been destroyed, is being destroyed, and therefore they will go. Their fates will be quite different in the future. The myths and falsehoods that were being propagated by Putin and by his entourage regarding Ukraine, that it's an artificial country, that it has no history, that they're basically Russians, it was never very tenable, and now, in light of recent events, it becomes absurd. So I think that looking ahead, we can well understand that Russia is going to be under tremendous pressure to change its psychology, because the imperial mentality has existed in Russia for hundreds of years. And without an empire, without the ability to control a nearby and related state such as Ukraine, the whole imperial enterprise, including its culture and psychology, it becomes untenable. So I think that if we look ahead at what's likely to happen, Russia will either be obliged to make a sharp turn toward the West and to reestablish relations with the winning side, or it could descend into real internal violence, including terror. So, but the one thing that I think we can exclude is some future union between Russia and Ukraine. I think that that ship has sailed, if it was ever possible at all.
And of course, if Lukashenko falls, it's quite probable to see that the people of Belarus, if they are able to take control of their administration, they too, I think, have had a certain divorce with that Russian imperial project. I mean, there's very little love lost now. There are Belarusian legion fighting in Ukraine. To an extent, you know, Russia's treatment of that country has burnt those bridges too.
Well, Russia's the only reason that Lukashenko is in power. And if Russia's hold, the Putin regime is the only reason Lukashenko is in power in Belarus. And if his hold on power is weakened, and Russia itself is weakened, it's hard to imagine that Lukashenko or anyone allied to him can continue to hold power in Belarus. And the attraction of the West for countries like Belarus and Ukraine is overwhelming. And the pressure of their example will be enormous on Russia itself. But the only thing that would then stand in the way of Russia once and for all casting its lot with the civilized world is the archaic political situation in the country that needs to be corrected. And the kind of moral and intellectual revolution on the part of the people that will have to come as a result of such definitive proof that the Russian model and the Russian psychology doesn't work. Not only doesn't work, but is dangerous and murderous, in particular for the people within Russia.
It's possible, isn't it, to see that in some future scenario you have Belarus, Ukraine, potentially as the new future borders of the EU, and that ties in very well with the Baltics geographically, and then Kaliningrad returning to the European fold, and that would basically unwind the post-war order that saw Russia gain significant control over large parts of Europe.
Yes, it would. Yeah, it definitely would. But it would be, of course, greatly to the benefit of Russia. And nations have demonstrated that they're capable of making radical changes in the direction of their history. Japan did it, Germany did it. The hope is that Russia is similarly capable. I mean, the people are not stupid. They've got to be seeing the terrible cost that is of imperial adventures that is obvious in Ukraine.
Well, David, it's been thrilling speaking to you again. Absolutely enlightening, and I've really enjoyed hearing how your personal experience of Russia informs these geopolitical issues. And I thank you so much for joining me on the channel again.
Well, glad to be with you, Jonathan, and I look forward to further contact.
Thank you.